Hello and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a new weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. At Frontier, we know how hard keeping up with everything in Myanmar can be. And in this podcast, I'm joined by journalists and experts to discuss some of the most consequential, convoluted, or just plain interesting stories of the past week. It's Friday, November 29th, 2024, and today, on our fifth episode, I'm joined by Zarni, senior producer for the Doh Athan podcast. Hello.
Hello, Luke.
And in the digital studio, we also have Myanmar researcher for Amnesty International, Joe Freeman. G'day, Joe. Hey, Luke. Now, before our guests get involved, let's quickly go over some of the week's updates. Conflict continues to rage across Myanmar with major incidents in several conflict zones this week. But, as we've seen for so many weeks, the military's use of airstrikes continues to cause the most damage and suffering nationwide. If we focus just on Chin State this week, where resistance groups battle for control of several major towns, airstrikes hit Hakka Township every day this week. Bombs blew up buildings in Mindat on Tuesday, and 20 miles east of Palam, an airstrike struck a village clinic, killing at least 6 civilians, according to residents. Those residents stressed there were no military targets anywhere in the vicinity. In Rakhine State, the major push by the Arakan Army, or AA, on the Western Regional Military Command headquarters in An Township continues to meet fierce opposition. The Myanmar military managed to substantially reinforce the command this week by road, and resistance forces' ambushes resulted in some fatalities but failed to stop military trucks reaching the HQ, or from soldiers lighting roadside villages on fire. In some better news for the civilians still trapped in An Town, 200 people were freed over the last weekend, helped along by the AA. And a new report by the Shan Human Rights Foundation this week details a huge increase in unregulated gold mining along the Sai River in Shan State since the 2021 military coup. Areas under the control of the United Wa State Army and a Lahu militia aligned with the Myanmar military have had the most mining and suffered the worst environmental degradation, allegedly to the benefit of unnamed Chinese investors. The erosion of the Sai River is blamed for contributing to flooding in the Thailand border towns Tachilek and Mae Sai earlier this year. In exile government years, Doh Athan, the acting president of the National Unity Government, or NUG, which was formed following the military's 2021 coup, spoke out on strategy this week. During a meeting on Tuesday, he stressed that the NUG cannot remain in exile and strongly urged all NUG members to return to Myanmar. Many NUG leaders abroad have benefited from the protection, support, and opportunities provided by democratic countries since the coup, but Doh Athan seems to be pointing out that this status quo no longer benefits the NUG overall, given the overwhelming impact China has on the country's political crisis and conflict. On that point, the Ta'an National Liberation Army, or TNLA, issued a statement this week saying it appreciates the Chinese government's mediation efforts to restore stability in northern Shan State, and that it is ready for peace talks with the Myanmar military. The TNLA and its Northern Alliance allies control nearly the entire Yunnan border in northern Shan State and southeastern Kachin State, and the TNLA is still holding onto its strategic gains from earlier this year in Mogok and Nongcho, in the face of heavy airstrikes and China's ongoing border closures. Whether the TNLA is genuinely interested in peace talks with the military or is simply appeasing China remains to be seen. And now, to you, Joe Freeman. You've reported and worked on human rights abuses and atrocities suffered by the Rohingya of Myanmar for years. And this week, we had a rare, major bureaucratic development. Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, or ICC, asked judges to grant an arrest warrant for Senior General Min Aung Hlaing over alleged crimes against humanity committed against Rohingyas in 2017. He said in a statement there are reasonable grounds to believe that Min Aung Hlaing bears criminal responsibility for crimes against humanity. The Myanmar military maintains that because the country is not a member of the court, it doesn't even acknowledge the ICC's statements or determinations. But Prosecutor Khan says that more warrants for other Myanmar officials are soon to follow. So, Joe, the ICC's statement may not change much in military-ruled parts of Myanmar in the short term, but how important or how much of a landmark is this request for a warrant to arrest Min Aung Hlaing?
I think you could easily describe it as landmark. Obviously, these things can take a while. It's only a request at this point, although most likely it's going to be approved. I think we can say that with some confidence. Obviously, there's lots of evidence from their investigation, from many investigations that could lead you to these determinations. The main problem in Myanmar, I mean, you could go back. It kind of depends how far you want to go back, but it's impunity. It's just there's a crisis that has led to these multiple crises, and that crisis is the crisis of accountability or the lack of accountability. And it's shocking to think that really to this day, you look back at the Rohingya crisis, 2017 to 2016. Obviously, there are waves of violence against them going back decades, but no senior leader has ever been held accountable for those atrocity crimes. And if they're not, just more violations will occur. And if you look at Min Aung Hlaing himself, I mean, he's at the center of multiple human rights catastrophes. So he oversaw the Rohingya crisis. He oversaw the campaign against them in 2016 and 2017. Nothing really happened to him except global outrage. I mean, we shouldn't say nothing happened to him. Obviously, there are these investigations which have led to this arrest warrant request. But he's still in power in Myanmar, and that does show a certain level of impunity and survivalism. And then of course in 2021, as I'm sure your listeners don't really need reminding, he led the 2021 coup, and we've seen what has come out of that. Thousands dead and economic, political, social chaos. So I think it is landmark, and that I think it sends a very important signal to him. I mean, he has to kind of be thinking that the walls are closing in a bit on him.
So you mentioned the preponderance of evidence here, and this particular request refers to the atrocities that took place in 2017 in particular, right? And the processes for this began in 2019. So just for people who aren't familiar with the court, why did it take so many years for the court to get to this point, which, it seems sort of obvious? Is it just about legal definitions?
I think there are a few things. At the end of the day, it's an organization, it's a bureaucracy like any other. I mean, I don't work there. I can't kind of speak to what internal processes they had to kind of get through to reach this point. They're probably not really getting going until 2018, and then you've got 2 years, and then there's a pandemic. Then there's the coup. I mean, there's all kinds of external factors that could be slowing them down. But I think what you're getting at is the sort of weird contrast between the slowness of these investigations and the moral kind of urgency that we all feel. Why are we waiting? Why is it taking so long? We shouldn't excuse that. I think that's still a totally fair thing to ask. You can't just say to Rohingya families, Rohingya survivors, international investigations take time. They obviously want justice now, and they deserve justice now. So I think it's kind of a twofold thing. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with taking your time and establishing an extremely strong case. Myanmar's also, at least before the coup and now, it hasn't been the best or easiest place to gather evidence from. The military is notoriously, I mean, again, your listeners know this, secretive. You can speak to people in Bangladesh, of course, but you can't access Myanmar, at least not. Sorry, you can access Myanmar, but you can't access Northern Rakhine State. It's not like the military is gonna, they're not a party to the Rome Statute, so they're not gonna say, "Oh, sure, come on into Rakhine State, and you can investigate all these incidents." So I think, yeah, it's a combination of things But all that being said, I think we all just recognize that there is a moral urgency to these things, and we should try to complete them, as quickly as possible, while still trying to gather the evidence and coming with a very substantive case. And that's, at the end of the day, if this ever sort of goes to court, they have to argue the actual case. And for that, it would probably be best if they have as much evidence as is possible to gather. So I would not doubt that it's a very strong case. I mean, without even being part of this investigation, having done my own work, but still they have to argue it, and gathering the evidence takes time.
Thank you, Joe. That's a balanced response. Now I want to ask you about Min Aung Hlaing's reliance on Russia and China, which are not ICC member countries, and his distance from the leaders of ICC member countries, except maybe Cambodia. So will an arrest warrant have any effect on the legitimacy and the recognition of military rule in Myanmar?
It's a good question. I think what I think it will do internationally is he's already very isolated. ASEAN he's still not going to ASEAN summits. So he's already a little isolated. If the arrest warrant is granted, if the request for the arrest warrant is granted, he has to think twice about going to certain countries. But you know what I think may be the biggest problem for him, and obviously I work for a human rights organization. I'm not necessarily a political analyst, but I would think that within the military itself, this could be a problem for him, because at the end of the day, they want to be seen as a legitimate, unifying spirit of Myanmar, and they can only be isolated so much. So it's certainly kind of, if not a game changer, it isolates him further, I think, from many different actors, from the international community, from ASEAN neighbors, and potentially, like I was saying, from the military itself.
And let's not forget that neighboring Bangladesh is an ICC member. So could this potential arrest warrant have ramifications in the Myanmar-Bangladesh relationship?
I don't know if it will have a huge impact on, I think, what is already a somewhat strained relationship, mainly due to the Rohingya crisis, which obviously is not new, right? It's been going on for decades, and Bangladesh has been hosting refugees for decades. What is more affecting their relationship right now is less so the arrest warrant, or if that's granted, but the fact that they have no control over, or are losing control in Rakhine State. More people are coming into Bangladesh, and Bangladesh has openly said, we cannot take any more refugees. So the strain on the relationship now is, I think, probably pretty great, and may only get worse. And you have, of course, the wild card is the Arakan Army, who at some point, and this is probably already happening, though there's not been too much public said about it, but at some point Bangladesh is going to have to engage with them, because they could potentially be the de facto authorities in Rakhine State who could potentially open up a humanitarian aid card or something along those lines.
And I understand you were just in Bangladesh. Has that informed your views?
Let me first talk about Rakhine State, and then the situation in Bangladesh. Obviously, like as you said, I went to Cox's Bazar, and I don't have access to Rakhine State, so I haven't been there. But the people I spoke with all came over in recent months. So for the Rohingya, I mean, there's a quote. I was looking back over some of the interviews I did, and some of what we published, and the quote that really stands out to me was one man I interviewed, and he said, "Every time there is a conflict, we get killed." They just they're trapped between the Arakan Army and the Myanmar military. The Myanmar military is cynically, conscripting them, which kind of, in the Arakan Army eyes, makes them the enemy too. Everyone I spoke to for all the violations that occurred, pointed the finger at the Arakan Army. their sort of future or their vision for Rakhine State, despite what they have said on different occasions, is very unclear. But what's becoming a little clear is that there may not be a place in it for the Rohingya. And even another interview I remember doing, one man said, in reference to the Arakan Army, he said, if this organization is the organizations that is going to control Rakhine State, well, we're screwed. Like there's no place for us there. So the people that I spoke to in September had all come over in the past couple of months. Many had been survivors of a drone attack that they said was carried out by the Arakan Army on August 5th. Many had lost relatives in that attack, or they'd lost relatives while fleeing by boat, across the Naf River. I think we interviewed maybe 22 people, and out of those, the vast majority, broke down in tears, describing what had happened to them. One man we spoke to, his wife drowned. They had been married 2 months ago. He showed us photos from their wedding, and then he has a photo of his wife's body. How do you move on from something like that? So while they're struggling to really just survive on a daily basis, living hand to mouth, they're also extremely traumatized and scared, and hopeless about the future. They're scared of going back to Myanmar. They're scared of being in the camps, and they have no documentation, so they feel very exposed, traumatized, and it really just reminded me of 2017 in the sense that their worlds have been completely upended. That with the main difference that in 2017 there did seem to be some moments where it appeared that with international support, people could go home one day, maybe. Now, there was really just no doubt in people's mind that Rakhine State was going to be a distant memory. They wanted to move to a place where they don't face apartheid conditions. They're not, as I said with that quote, every time there's a conflict, they get killed. I think they've just had enough, and they want to move on. I can't speak for everyone there more than the people we interviewed, but the sense that I really got was, that's it. Like it's time to just live somewhere else and stop hoping that the Myanmar military or the Arakan Army or various other groups will accept us. And that's, I think, quite heartbreaking.
It truly is, Joe, and every week it just seems to get worse and worse. We look forward to reading and hearing more from Amnesty International regarding the Rohingya crisis in the future. Now I want to talk to you, the listener, because this week we saw a bumper crop of online content coming from Frontier Myanmar, and most of it is available free on the website, frontiermyanmar.net. So log on and check out the feature stories you missed. There's one feature explaining the difficulties that workers encounter trying to find honest brokers for jobs in Yunnan. There's an opinion piece by Ijaz Kat on the Arakan Army's conduct in Rakhine State. And, of course, Matthew Grunweiss's trawl through the murky waters of the Naf River, where Bangladesh fishermen toil at risk of the Myanmar Navy. We interviewed him about that story on last week's episode. Now, let's get back to the show. If you're a regular reader of Frontier Myanmar and a regular listener of this podcast, then you may also be learning the Mazagar, the Burmese language, like me. If so, or otherwise, have you ever wondered about Burmese language podcasts? Because Frontier actually has hosted a bilingual podcast for several years called Doh Athan, which means our voice. Now, Doh Athan focuses on human rights issues, and it releases Burmese and English language versions of its episodes every week. So, Zarni, you're the senior producer of Doh Athan, and you're here to talk a little bit about that podcast and what it's like producing a Burmese language podcast. You'll also give us a behind-the-scenes look at next week's episode. Now, I should mention that Doh Athan is award-winning. It won the podcast award at the Human Rights Press Awards in 2024 for 2 episodes, and it won an honourable mention for SOPA this year for another episode about political prisoners' families falling prey to scammers. So, Zarni, could you please tell us a bit more about Doh Athan, maybe starting with how it began and why is it called Doh Athan?
Yeah. Firstly, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's great to be here. Doh Athan is started in 2017 as a joint project, Foundation here and there, and Frontier Myanmar. At the time, some media were doing radio, but not really podcasts. Doh Athan was given with the intention of being voices for the voiceless people. Yeah. The main goal of Doh Athan is focus on underreported human rights stories and the stories of marginalized communities. And I joined Doh Athan at the beginnings. At the time, there's three members, me, a journalist, and editor. I had TV experience, but no radio. I saw an advertisement on Frontier Myanmar, and I was interested. That time, I've done human rights trainings, and I thought I could learn new skills. That's why I joined Doh Athan.
Right, so that's now many years of podcast producing. You must have done hundreds of episodes. How many have you done?
It's, to be exact, 362 episodes.
Wow, that is a huge achievement. That's nearly one for every day of the year.
Yes.
Now, I know this might be a hard question, but do you have any favorites? Are there any that you're the most proud of?
I'm proud of all the episodes we produce. As a senior producer, I work with the team, freelancers, and partner medias to help them to produce the episodes. And there is the one I produced, which really make an impact. It is an episode in 2018 and about women's making reusable sanitary pads out of cloth. So that time, they didn't have the job, and one of the women in the group, she had suggested to make a item, and they found a cooperative. I went to their village with my colleagues, and we covered not only for podcast but also for the Frontier Myanmar. Before we published that story, they didn't have the context, and they don't know how to say their items. After we published that story, some INGO contact us how to connect with those women because they want to buy their items for the IDPs. So I was really satisfied to make that story. And another one is more recently, I produced that story is about the Rohingya who suffered a lot during the recent banning of Butita. I went to Rakhine State in 2010 and I saw so many things in the camp and on the ground. It's really complicated. So I heard about Butita in the news and I wanted to know what happened there that night. So I decided to do a podcast. And after interviewing many residents who were there, I realized that it is even worse than I had understood before. It's really bad situation, and I felt glad that I covered that story. And good news, I got good feedback from the Rohingya communities. But for me, I have another challenge because whenever we cover Rohingya, we got rude comments from some people on social media, and they insult us sexually. So I have to prepare my mind before I cover that story.
Zani, I'm really sorry to hear that. That's awful. Nobody should ever experience that kind of abuse, especially when you're doing such a great job. Yeah, that's awful. Not all of the challenges that you encounter producing this podcast are so terrible. Some of them are more practical in nature, and this is a multilingual podcast, so it comes out in Burmese and in English. But many of the people's voices that you amplify in your podcast actually don't speak Burmese, and they come from different linguistic communities like the Kachin or the Karenni. So how do you manage to deal with that conundrum when producing episodes?
Yeah, it's quite challenging. And so our production process is long-winded. We discuss the story idea with editor in English first. The script is written Burmese, and then it's translated to English. The final edit is in English, and then translate back to Burmese. So it's long process. Yeah, and for the so when we interview with ethnic peoples and Rohingyas, so it's more complicated. For example, the episode we will produce next week is about the domestic violence, and we went to the Mahasal, but we couldn't get into the camp. So KNWO, currently National Women Organization, helped us to get some interviews of survivors in the camps, and they interview in Karenni language. So the translation was needed.
Okay, wow. So we're going to play the current episode of Doh Athan after this interview, but you're talking about the next episode, which is going to drop in English on Sunday. Tell us more about this. So domestic violence in refugee camps in Mae Hong Son. Yeah, please.
Yes, it is about domestic violence in the camp along the border around Mae Hong Son. So our editor saw a report from Karenni National Women Organization that they were running awareness domestic violence workshop in the camps. And yes, myself and a journalist went to the Mae Hong Son to find out more. And we discovered that it is difficult for the women to get out of domestic violence in the camps because they cannot go anywhere. They can leave the camps. And so it's really challenging for them. But KNWO is helping them. And we got a positive story about women who had managed to leave domestic abuses. And yeah, we got that story.
Fantastic. Well, I can't wait to hear that. Now, I want to kind of broaden the conversation a little bit out from Doh Athan to talking about Burmese podcasts in general. You know, Myanmar has a lot of electricity problems, but still, smartphones are very, very popular. So I wanted to ask you, how popular are podcasts in Myanmar in 2024?
It is difficult to get the data to know how many Burmese people listen podcasts, but I see sometimes subscribers and followers are increasing for some of the shows. But definitely is podcast is growing so fast, and we can see so many Burmese podcasts on various platforms.
Okay, so in that case, Zarni, what's your favorite Myanmar language podcast?
Yeah, my favorite podcast is 92 Point Mama. That's produced by a famous singer, and it was quite popular. But he hasn't produced much recently. Yeah, and that podcast, I think most of the Burmese listen that podcast because I heard one podcast of him. He said he got 1 million listener of his podcast. So I think that was this is a quite popular podcast. And this is a Burmese podcast network is growing in popularity, and they talk about politics, sports, entertainment, and many things. Actually, I listen a lot, most of the podcasts, and yeah, 92 Point Obama is my favorite one.
All right, that's a cool recommendation. And it also makes me think that, you know, most people, so not just Burmese people, but most people around the world, they generally prefer to listen to, you know, entertainment and gossip and this kind of thing. Now, your podcast, Doh Athan, has very serious subject matter. So do you find it difficult trying to engage listeners to tune in and listen to Doh Athan?
Yes, yeah, it is quite challenging for us to produce human rights podcasts because according to our country situation, most of all the people suffer a lot, and so they don't want to listen, and that's that thing. And but one thing, good news, when we make a survey for our podcast, some people are really interested in listening our podcast because our podcast is focused on the human interest. And one man said he listened our podcast when he was free time because he feel like talking about the story, not telling the news, just like listening a story. So that's why he listened it. But we also stay have a challenge to get many audience. Yeah, but we are trying our best.
All right. So, for people like him, for any fans out there, what's the best way to contact you? If someone just wants to ask you about the show or they have an idea for an episode on an underreported human rights issue in Myanmar, how should they get in touch?
Probably the easiest way is Facebook Messenger. But we also on YouTube and Telegram. So we are always happy to get the idea from our audience. And being based outside the Myanmar is very difficult for us. But we work with freelancers, partner medias. Some of them are in the country. Our audience may be aware of important issues that we don't hear about. So I want to hear from the audience about issues affecting them.
Yes, and I really hope that people do get in contact. Yeah, the contact details are in the show notes below this episode. Now, for those of you who are not regular Doh Athan listeners, here is the most recent episode playing in full here at the tail end of what's happening in Myanmar.
They get sick often. High fevers, coughs, runny noses. We do our best to feed them, but it's hard with so little.
Refugees are malnourished, and it's especially bad for kids under 5 and pregnant women. It's simple. They don't have enough to eat.
The conflict sparked by the military coup has disrupted food production and transportation and devastated the economy. This means that many of the 3 million people displaced by the conflict are now facing malnutrition. Hello and welcome to Doh Athan, a weekly podcast about human rights stories from Myanmar. It's brought to you by Fondation Hirondelle. This episode is produced by a Doh Athan journalist. Names and voices may have been changed to protect contributors.
I always put my mom first. If we have fish, I'll pick out a good piece for her. I try to buy meat and fish when I can, just for her. For myself, I make do with whatever I can find. Watercress, rosella leaves, whatever's available. She's old, so I want her to have something decent to eat. But it's not every day, only when I can manage it.
Doh Mo, her 80-year-old mother, and her husband and daughter have been living in a camp for internally displaced people, or IDPs, for almost 2 years. There are about 200 people in this camp and only 4 toilets. The camp is in a resistance-controlled area between Bago region and Cayenne state. The resistance provides small rations of rice, noodles and dried fish, but otherwise the IDPs get no outside support. Doh Mo and her family used to live in a 2-story brick and wood house in their village, and they traded goods for a living. But in early 2023, their house was burned down by Myanmar military forces, and they had to flee from fighting. Now they're living in a small bamboo hut. For 3 months a year, during fishing season, they can get work at a nearby pond for about 7,000 kyat a day. That's less than $2. The rest of the year, they have to borrow money and forage for vegetables. This means they can't feed Doh Mo's elderly mother well. She often falls ill and suffers from diarrhea.
In the past year and a half, my mom has fallen sick 4, 5, maybe 6 times. With the way things are here with the food situation, her health just isn't holding up. Whenever she gets sick, it can last 4 days to a week. She's weak, can't eat properly. And this isn't home for us. I think for an elderly person, it's hard to feel comfortable in a place that's not their own.
Saya Chin is a doctor as well as a member of a revolutionary force. He treats displaced people in Cayenne and Bogor camps. He says food and nutrition are severely lacking in the camps he visits.
The rations aren't enough. There are many things that they need. They give some rice and food, but it's always just a little. Everyone tries to make it work. At the IDP camps, I saw people sharing whatever they had: chili, fish paste, anything to get by.
According to the World Food Programme, 13 million out of 50 million people in Myanmar lack enough food. Among them, displaced people from conflict zones face the most severe shortages following the 2021 coup. The National Unity Government, or NUG, has acknowledged nutritional deficiencies among IDPs, although data is still being collected, so the exact number is not known. Dr. Victory, spokesperson for the NUG's Health Ministry Nutritional Development Department, says children and pregnant women are most affected by malnutrition.
Refugees are malnourished, and it's especially bad for kids under 5 and pregnant women. It's simple. They don't have enough to eat. Added to that, there are diseases going around, and it just makes the malnutrition worse. They're in these camps because of the SAC's violence, having to leave their hometowns, and they do not have access to nutritious food here or even clean water, so the diseases spread.
In Sagaing region, Doh Win's 7-month-old grandson is one of these at-risk children. She and her daughter and the baby, as well as 2 sons, have been displaced for more than 2 years. Their village was torched by the military. Like most IDPs, they struggle to get by, with just occasional help from local donors. Her sons manage to get odd jobs about 10 days a month. Their daily earnings then are around 10,000 kyat, that's a little over $2. That's barely enough to survive with rising commodity prices.
It's not enough. So we're just trying to stretch what we have. We get by with whatever people offer us. My grandchild is 7 months old now. My daughter breastfeeds him, and sometimes we mix rice with a bit of oil and salt. We just can't afford the formula. It costs 700 or 800 kyat.
The family is living in a camp of around 100 people, about 16 kilometres from their home, sleeping under a palm leaf and bamboo shelter. The lack of nutritious food causes the camp children, including Doh Win's grandson, to become frequently ill.
They get sick often. High fevers, coughs, runny noses. We do our best to feed them, but it's hard with so little. What can we do? We cannot afford it. Of course I want to give my grandchild the food he needs. Another 2 grandchildren who live nearby can't even go to school. It all depends on whether we have enough to eat. On days we don't, they just stay home. They're worse off. They survive on fish paste and whatever we have.
There are many camps in resistance-controlled areas which are hard for aid groups to reach, particularly in the dry zone and in places far from the border. Conflict has disrupted farming and made transportation of food more difficult. But the military regime has also made it harder for support to reach these IDPs. Dr. Victory says the NUG doesn't get the kind of food aid that it used to.
We used to get these nutritious food packages, let's call it healing food, thanks to UNICEF. But now, we're not receiving them anymore. Even if UNICEF buys them, they don't make it to the children and civilians who need them. The SAC has tightened restrictions on NGOs, blocking food and nutrition supplies that they used to allow. If this keeps up, children's lives are at serious risk.
Indeed, the UN and international organisations are unable to reach many parts of the country either because of access or security issues. Earlier this year, a UN OCHA official estimated that over 18 million people in Myanmar would need humanitarian assistance, but the UN had only reached just over 3 million the previous year. Most of the aid being provided to displaced people is from local donors and community groups. Mathinza A is from Clean Yangon Group, which supports IDPs in Karenni and Chin states and the dry zone. They send dry foods and rice and sometimes distribute meals. But she says as time goes on, fewer people are able to donate to their group.
It's been almost 4 years since the coup, and donors are doing their best to help the IDPs meet their needs to provide comprehensive aid. We mostly see the same people helping people out. The other thing is, times are hard for everyone, so people can only donate if they're doing okay themselves. That means we don't have many new donors, just the same ones who are trying their best to keep supporting.
In this situation, revolutionary and medic Saya Chin says resistance forces need to do more to help meet the needs of displaced people in their areas.
I think it depends on the local authorities. It reflects the generosity they have towards the public. Some prioritize security, but it's tough on these people. This needs attention. Sure, there are other issues, but displaced people need more support, and we should care more for them. We need to ask what they need.
Bo Swan is commander of the 28th Battalion in Yinma Bin Township in Sagaing region. There are around 200 IDPs in his area, but he says his battalion only gets support from the NUG once every 3 months, and they don't have enough resources to help IDPs regularly.
We prepare lunchboxes and cook for them when we can. I feel so sorry for the displaced people, and we really want to help more. But we're quite stretched ourselves, having to focus on our comrades on the front line, and those in training.
So as the number of internally displaced people grows, now over 3 million according to the UN, the sources of help are shrinking. There's not much hope for more or better food or for improved living conditions for people like Doh. She and her family are only about 11 kilometers away from their village in Bago region. But for now, they're confined to their IDP hut by the camp toilets, not far from pig pens and chicken coops. It's not a pleasant environment. She just wants to go home so she can properly care for her elderly mother.
I just want to go back to our village. Life is cheaper there. There's plenty of food and we're close to the city, so I can easily get things for my mom. There are jobs there too, like vending or something else. Here, there's no work. I just want to go home.
Thanks for listening to this edition of Doh Athan. We'd welcome your feedback on social media, and please follow or subscribe to our pages. This project on human rights reporting is supported by Fondation Hirondelle with the help of our donors. You can listen to our podcasts via the Doh Athan Facebook page. They can also be found on SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify and Telegram. You can also listen every Saturday night from 9 to 10 p.m. and Sunday morning from 6 to 7 a.m. on Voice of America Radio. Please tune in again next week.
And there we have it. If you have never listened to Doh Athan before, I'm sure you agree that it is worth a like and subscribe. And with that, we come up to the end of what's happening in Myanmar for another week. Remember, you can contact us at whimyanmar@proton.me, and that address is reproduced in the show notes. Now let's say goodbye. Thanks so much for being on the show, Joe.
Thanks for having me.
And Zarni, what an awesome episode. Thanks again.
Thank you, Luke, for giving me the opportunity of talking about our podcast.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Okay, time to say goodbye. So farewell to all and take care. Until next week. Ciao.